Today, we're going to be talking about public opinion and media in Texas. And before we can actually do that, we kind of need to figure out, where do our opinions actually come from? And so our opinions and basically our political philosophies and all of that, it all kind of stems from something we call political socialization. And what that basically means is everything around you influences you. The people who brought you up, the people who you live with day to day, the people you interact with at the local coffee shop. All of these people interact with you in a different way that causes you to basically develop your political socialization over time. This isn't something you get like instantly. So people don't like get their political socialization just by walking into a building and then suddenly that's what happens. There's like a misunderstanding quite often where like politicians will try to blame media or try to blame schools themselves by saying that they, politically socialize somebody by one specific class that you took or something like that. That doesn't happen. You've gotten to where you are today from years and years of, being exposed to all different types of ideas right from the very beginning, from when, you first started dealing with your parents or whoever your people you followed at that particular time. That creates your socialization, your political opinions. Also, even the people that you consider influencers. So if like there's someone that you follow, someone that you find to be really important to pretty much everything you do, the role model that's actually out there for you, that person helps create and develop your political socialization so that you can't just put it onto one thing, but you put it onto quite a few different things. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the things that kind of make a difference on political opinion, and basically how people feel about particular issues. And basically, how do you gauge it? Like, how do you figure out how different people actually think about different things? Well, historically, what we used to do is basically, keep saying the word basically, what we used to do is we used to actually poll people. We used to actually go out and ask them what they actually think. So people would get out onto the street and find a whole bunch of people out there and talk to each one of them and say, how do you feel about this particular issue? This kind of developed into a concept we call straw polls. Straw polls, as they developed further and further, we tended to use like phone calls quite often. There's a famous incident that happens back during one of the early 1960 elections, presidential elections, where they, again, my throat. So what they tried to do is they tried to figure out how people were going to be voting for a particular election. Are they for or against Eisenhower? And so what they did is they put out these phone calls asking people what their actual opinions are, and then determined that Dewey was going to actually win the race. And turned out they were completely wrong, because one thing they didn't realize is the phone calls that they were making were to people who could actually afford to have phones, and people who could have phones in their houses, and people who were there at their house able to take a phone call was a small number in comparison to the people who weren't, which meant there was a lot of people not actually being canvassed, which meant they had no idea who was actually voting for what. Yet, because all they had available to them were phone calls, they thought that gave them the numbers that they actually wanted. So we've kind of gotten a little better at that over the years, because we start to realize, certain factors can influence it. So we start doing things like we call exit polls. So after an election, people will stand outside and canvass the people who actually voted to kind of get an idea of how they actually voted, and then take those numbers and then try to apply them onto national numbers. I won't get into the way statistics work, but you need a certain percentage of the people who actually voted in order to figure out if your straw poll is actually, significant. One thing that's actually been a real benefit and will be a benefit kind of going forward and figuring out, straw polls is the internet itself, because the internet, you can canvass large numbers of people to get really good, assessments of how actually people think about particular issues. A small problem with that, and this is something to keep in mind and something we're still trying to figure out, or at least trying to um, fix the errors for. Um, like if you do straw polls on the internet, quite often people will vote multiple times, and they haven't figured out ways to actually stop that from actually happening. So people can actually influence an actual election by overloading it with the amount of people and the amount of votes that they put into it. So it's not one vote per person, but can be, a couple thousand votes per person. And so once they've gotten past that, internet voting might actually be a better gauge of straw polls. One of the other kinds of polls that they tend to do, and we do a lot today, is called push polls. Now, what a push poll is if I ask you a question and I say, how do you feel about this particular issue? Hopefully I'll get the correct answer. That's not a push poll, that's a straw poll. A push poll is if I walk up to you and I say, how do you feel about this particular individual who did all of these bad things? Automatically, I'm getting you being influenced by my question itself, which then serves to actually get kind of a skewed answer. So then I can come out and say, all of these people don't like this particular candidate, so therefore people are not going to be voting for him. And that may skew his or her numbers going forward. And we do that all the time today in basically polls, because politicians realize it's useful. It's a useful tool. And so they use it in a lot of their question polls to people, because they want to influence the actual election before it actually happens. So kind of keep that in mind. So let's talk about the media itself. What is the media? Well, think about it. Media has been around for quite a while. And one of the things that's really important to our country, at least the United States, is we developed a system to where the media is pretty powerful, meaning government is not the most powerful thing out there. Granted, government has the power, but the media can influence the power. And so what our founders did, Franklin and the rest of the founders, when they were putting the ideas together in our Constitution, was to make sure that if you wanted to criticize the government, you're actually allowed to do it. And so Franklin, who actually, ran a newspaper, created this journalism aspect to where we don't, tell media what you can and can't do. And so media therefore can actually challenge government directly, by literally being able to ask them questions, being able to report on their opinions on specific issues. And so it's kind of led to all sorts of other things. And so without getting into the deep nitty gritty of all that kind of stuff, let's talk about some of the things that are important when dealing with the media itself, like some of the definitions you should probably know, such as mass media. Mass media, basically what we're talking about is, reaching a lot of people. In the olden days, when we made our Constitution, a newspaper would reach quite a few people. Now we have the internet, we have television, we have movies, we have all sorts of different avenues that can actually reach, huge numbers of people. And that's kind of important. Not only that, we have international media that we've never actually had before. So we have, like during conflicts, we have Twitter now actually making an ability to, providing an ability to give, stories that they couldn't give before, because your regular media didn't have access to all sorts of information and didn't have immediacy. Like it couldn't actually just tell you what's going on right at this particular moment, because quite often government would come in and stomped them before they had a chance to actually do it. So that's kind of an important factor to keep in the back of your mind. There's something we call a gatekeeping function, and kind of understand what this is, because historically that's how media used to actually control quite a bit of the issues that were going forward. If a newspaper didn't want you to know a specific issue, basically they didn't report it. And if they didn't report it, you didn't know anything about it. And so that's what the gatekeeping function was. Well, like I mentioned, we've now got stuff like the internet, we've got, Twitter, we've got Facebook, we've got all of these different kinds of avenues that we didn't have before, to where the gatekeeping function that the original mass media companies actually controlled don't have that control anymore. And so that's kind of opened up a whole different avenue into getting information. Whether or not that information is good information is a completely different story, but it's one of those things you should be thinking about whenever you're talking about media, because this leads to something which we call like agenda setting. And this is the power of the media to bring, issues and problems to the public's attention. And so they can decide, what things are important for you to listen to or to pay attention to. And quite often they do it in a couple of different ways, such as like priming and framing. Priming, which is the ability of the media to help shape public opinion, and framing, which is a media's attempt to focus attention on certain events and place them with the context for meaning, so that you understand what they want you to understand based on a particular story that they're actually telling you. So they can tell you, like the whole idea of a frame, they put the lines around a story, so you're going to only focus on these particular things. This has led to what is often referred to as the CNN effect. CNN, which is the huge media company that when they came around, they had this idea of they were going to create a news agency for television that would be 24-hour news. Because before then, if you watched the news, you were watching it at 6 o'clock at night, maybe at 11 o'clock at night. Quite often it was the same stories. And that's all you ever really got. Well, CNN believed that there was enough media or enough information that's actually available out there that we could actually start, pronouncing it or publishing it 24 hours. So you'd have all of this information to fill in a particular broadcast. Well, what that does is that gives the effect of 24-hour broadcasts of live news media, to where people think that, things do have this immediacy effect that is really important for them to actually know. Part of the problem with that is quite often, if you've watched, like, say, CNN or any television news agency that covers 24-hour news, they repeat a lot of the same stories over and over again. So it gets to the point where that 24-hour news, there really wasn't enough to actually fill it in there, but they kind of went into it with the belief that that's what they were actually going to do. So let's talk about a couple of other things that are really important for the media. And these are things that have happened very much recently. So basically from the 1990s on, because 1991 basically is the birth of the World Wide Web. It's a little bit before that with ARPANET and stuff like that. But the idea that we had this immediacy effect of all of this information, then anybody could access it, and it was no longer specific people that could give you the news. It could be pretty much everybody. We created what's called internet and citizen journalism. And so a really good example of this is if you look at some of the incidents that have happened recently during like the Ukraine Russia war that was happening, and like the Afghanistan war that was happening previously before that. A lot of events that were actually happening were being reported by just your common person with a cell phone. This is something that we've never actually had before, because it was always you had media people, like CNN was there, or you had, the New York Times, or you had CBS, NBC, ABC News, these agencies, Fox News, whatever company or corporation that was actually providing all of this, Reuters and um, AP, all of these different ones. Well, you don't need that anymore. I mean, one thing they have as an advantage is they're trained to actually do this, but at the same time, citizen journalists are kind of providing, like I said, the immediacy effect of people on the street observing this without an actual filter. And remember, we talked about gatekeeping functions before. Those gatekeeping functions are gone. And so now you're getting immediate information, which can lead to bad information. And it can also lead to very good information. The problem is you have to now filter what's good and what's bad. Problem is, it's very hard to actually do that. So this has brought us kind of like in a balance between traditional, like with television, radio, newspapers, versus new technology like the internet, streaming, YouTube, all of these kinds of things. So we're kind of in that middle ground right now where we're kind of moving to a new generation of kind of technology. And we still don't have the background to make the new technology as solid as some of the traditional technology has always been. So this can quite often lead to media bias, which is the actual or perceived failure of media to report the news objectively. And this can be a real problem because if people have a specific purpose in wanting to report particular stories, like there's an end goal to it that may not be, pronounced to the audience that's watching the news itself, that can be a bit of a problem. And so a couple of other things kind of build into that, which is we have selection bias, which is a selection of news that presents a distorted view of reality. And we have presentation bias, which is a result of how a story is written or presented. So these kind of things become a bit of a problem. And we tried to solve some of this back during the traditional era, which with rules like equal time rules. And what this meant was if you were on television and you were a news agency and you reported on a particular candidate that was running for office, well, you had to give time to the person running against him or her, equal amount of time. And so that was called the equal time rule. So what ended up happening is a lot of news agencies decided we're just not going to report anybody. We're not going to give them any time anymore because we don't have the time or the desire to give the other side equal amounts of time. So that's become a bit of a problem. Now with the internet, it's not really a problem because those same rules don't apply. The FCC is trying to make that happen, or at least they're trying to put forth rules that will make that happen, but they haven't gotten there yet. So that's still kind of up in the air. Net neutrality rules have attempted to, solidify this problem or to solve this problem, but they haven't really gotten there yet. So they're still kind of working it, and there'll probably be a number of pieces of legislation that probably get us to that particular situation solution, hopefully, or we never will solve it. That's kind of where we are. So the other question I want to ask you that's really important for you to kind of keep in the back of your mind is who actually owns the media? So, I mean, we talked about before Benjamin Franklin and individuals who created newspapers a long time ago, as part of constitutional issues to where they could actually report the news and there were no, government constraints on them other than kind of what's happened over time through attrition. But what's happened is over time, as media has gotten stronger and more powerful, they've started scooping themselves up. So you'll have a bunch of companies that own pretty much all of the smaller companies, and they bought out a lot of the media companies out there. So like if you had like a local newspaper, there's a very good chance you don't have a local newspaper anymore. It got bought by a much bigger company. So that means either the information is still being reported as it was before by that smaller company, with oversight of a much higher company, or they may actually have all of their information being filtered by that top company, determining what you're allowed to actually listen to or read or listen to. So kind of keep that in mind. You should be aware of that, and pay a little closer attention to kind of like where your news is actually coming from. Because remember, the people who are telling you news, like if you hear a story from somebody else, they're getting it from somewhere, and it's pretty hard to figure out where exactly they're getting it from and where the original source may actually be. So some of these companies we've talked about that we're talking about is like, AT&T, which owns a whole bunch of other companies like HBO and all of these. I think they own Warner Media and all of these different smaller companies, which are pretty big, but still much smaller than the larger entity itself. And so each one of these bigger companies owns so many others. There's a really good chart in the book you should definitely look at, because it definitely explains how media ownership is happening. And it's constantly changing to this day. There are still companies buying other companies. And so be aware of who owns what and whether or not that's changing the view that you're actually getting in the media that's coming to you. I mean, you may be getting good information, or you may be getting very skewed information, depending on where the original source is actually coming from and who actually owns the sources themselves. So that's the basics of what we're kind of talking about from media. Be aware of where your news is actually coming from. So that way you can actually figure out if, your news is valid, because one of the hardest things to figure out is whether or not your media that you're getting is actually good media, or whether or not you're just you're being told a story from somebody else who has a specific agenda that he or she wants you to basically follow. So the more you are aware of these particular factors, the better your information can be in the long run. Always remember that.